Welcome to the Schuylkill Center's Thursday Night Live. I'm Aaliyah Ross. I'm the Schuylkill Center's Director of Education. And tonight is the final installment of Thursday Night Live for the winter-spring 2023 season. We'll resume the series in the fall. And tonight we have a really great program for tonight. We have an environmental justice roundtable featuring a panel of guest speakers to discuss issues of environmental justice in Philadelphia. So I am sharing my screen tonight so that you can all see this introduction, and I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. So I'd like to remind everyone that this meeting is being recorded. You can feel free to turn your camera off if you don't want to be visible. We also ask that you keep your microphone on mute while listening. During the talk, please feel free to put any questions in the chat. We're going to get to those questions and pose them to our panel throughout the evening. So please feel free to put all those questions in the chat. And we begin this evening by acknowledging that the Schuylkill Center's 365 acres are located in Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral lands of Lenape people, whose presence and resilience continues to this day in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, as well as in the Turtle Island diaspora. We honor the original caretakers of this land, recognize the difficult history that brought us here, and moving forward, seek to establish meaningful partnerships with the Lenape community. We are officially in the spring season, official as of this Monday, which means that this is a fantastic time to explore the center's 4 miles of nature trails. Our trails are open daily, and our visitor center is open Monday through Saturday from 9 to 5. So come on out and see the spring bloom on our trails. The center offers a wide range of environmental education programs, from school field trips and Saturday hikes to our after-school program, day off camps, scout programs, wellness events, and more. There's something for everybody. And you can learn more about our offerings on our website, schuylkillcenter.org. The Schuylkill Center is also home of the Nature Preschool. We have 4 preschool classes for kids ages 3 to 5, and we're currently registering for the upcoming school year. You can also find out more information about our Nature Preschool on our website. Registration is also underway for Camp Schuylkill. Campers spend the summer exploring our 365 acres of forests, fields, ponds, and streams. Spaces are going quickly, so visit our website and register today. The center also has a vibrant environmental art department with both an indoor gallery in our visitor center and several art pieces on our trails. The current show on exhibition is Walking the Edge, Art from Our Borders and Boundaries. If you have not seen it yet, please do plan a visit soon. It closes in a little over a week on Saturday, April 1st. So please come and check out Walking the Edge. Volunteers help us accomplish our mission of connecting people to nature in so many ways, from assisting with trail maintenance to helping count toads during spring migration, to helping clinic staff care for sick and injured wildlife. There are many opportunities to volunteer with the center. And members also play a really important role at the center. The support of members makes it possible for us to offer free programming like Thursday Night Live. Members receive discounts on programs and in the gift shop, plus advance notice of exclusive programs. You can join on our website. And if you're already a member, thank you so much for your support. And lastly, Wild Philly, the first book written by the center's own Mike Weilbacher, our executive director, which explores the amazing nature in and around our city, is now on sale. You can purchase it online. You can also pick it up in our gift shop. It's a really beautiful and fun book. It's a must-have for nature lovers in Philly. So I encourage you all to come pick up a copy of Wild Philly. Okay, so once again, thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and get started with our program. I'll go ahead and hit stop the share. All right. So once again, thank you all for joining us for this important discussion tonight. Environmental justice, it addresses the distribution of access to environmental resources like public green spaces, as well as the distribution of exposure to environmental hazards. Most often, these are not equitably distributed, and poor communities and Black and Brown communities often bear the brunt of exposure to environmental harms. And in Philadelphia, we see it in the increased flooding risk to many communities in Southwest Philly, the lack of tree canopy in other neighborhoods. And these things have real measurable impacts on health and on quality of life in our city. So we have an esteemed panel of guest speakers joining us tonight for this discussion. Please welcome Genevieve LaMarr LeMee. She is the Senior Advisor for Environmental Justice with the City of Philadelphia's Office of Sustainability. Welcome, Genevieve. Also joining us is Jerome Shabazz. Jerome is the Executive Director of the Overbrook Environmental Education Center and Jazz Tech Incorporated. Thanks for joining us, Jerome. And also joining us is Maurice Sampson. Maurice is the Eastern Pennsylvania Director of Clean Water Action.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. So I'm going to, I've prepared some questions. I'm going to go ahead and get the discussion started with some questions, but feel free to place any questions that you have in the chat, and we will get to them throughout the program tonight. So I'm going to pose the first question to Genevieve. Genevieve, the environmental justice has been in the public conversation for a long time. It's something that has been talked about for years and years on the grassroots level, on the state level, the city level. With all of the talking that we've been doing about environmental justice for all these years, in your opinion, are we making progress on this issue?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And there's a lot of work that's been happening for decades. I'm joining here as from the city, obviously, and I think we're pretty late to talking about environmental justice and to addressing it. But what gives me hope is that we're seeing commitment from all levels of government to be addressing this issue right now, and historic levels of investment in this. And so I think it's important to note when I say commitment that it's not just as using words to communicate that's not very effective, but seeing financial resources going towards environmental justice initiatives. And there should be policy changes and legislation that follows that as well. So it's exciting to see kind of this commitment through budgets. And again, the billions of dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act at the federal level. Also in President Biden's proposed budget, almost $2 billion more for environmental justice initiatives. Locally, I think also it's really important that we're now seeing a commitment to environmental justice in the budget as well. And so $1 million over the next 5 years for environmental justice initiatives within the city of Philadelphia is really exciting to see and important. So I think that we're making important steps in the city. There's a lot more work that needs to happen. We're definitely not doing enough at this point in time. I'm really hoping to see more policy and legislation coming forward, but I still think that there have been big steps there too, with the executive order signed last week, formally establishing the Environmental Justice Advisory Commission. And we also saw the Philly Tree Plan released, I think, a month ago. And so looking forward to seeing implementation from that. So I think there's important steps being made by departments, by the mayor's office, and council tightening requirements or protections for trees in the city, but we do have a lot more work to do so that we're realizing environmental justice.
Can you give me, say, 3 issues that concern you that people should be aware of?
Sure. So the top 3 that are top of mind for me right now, as an office, the Office of Sustainability is really concerned about Philadelphia becoming hotter and wetter. And so I'll focus on heat as the first issue. But you mentioned this already, Aaliyah, in the opening, but there's not, tree canopy doesn't look the same in every neighborhood. So while we know the city as a whole is going to be hotter, there will be, more summer days that are over 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Some parts of the city are going to be even warmer than that, and parts of the city that don't have that tree cover that will keep temperatures lower. So I'm concerned about temperature and how vulnerable populations will be impacted by that, and how that'll be disparately felt across the city. And the other 2 that I'll name are related to that. So concerned about access to utilities, affordable utilities, residents being able to heat and cool their homes and also have clean drinking water. That becomes an even bigger concern in a warmer city, right? If you aren't able to cool your home, and knowing that a lot of assistance programs focus on heating. So I think that's something that we're going to really have to address to make sure residents can cool their homes, but also that everyone has access to safe, clean drinking water and to heat in the winter, or to, heating in the winter, utilities. And then the third one, thinking about air quality. We need to be doing better monitoring of air quality in the city. There's been some increased monitoring in the last year, but I think we need to work on that, and also thinking about, as temperatures increase, how that will make things like asthma worse and how that'll combine with other pollutants in the air. So that's the last one I would say I'm concerned about of the three, is air quality and connections to asthma, and also other seasonal allergies with our pollen season being extended due to an increased temperature.
Thank you, Genevieve. Jerome, well, I'd like you to also to respond to that question. What are some, let's say, 3 issues that concern you particularly about environmental justice and health in the city?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you for the invitation. I think Genevieve sort of touched on some of the important ones. I think in Philadelphia, we know that increased rainfall has great deal of implications on a variety of our environmental systems in the city as well as heat. So we know that the climate shifts for us is increased heat and increased rainfall. But I think the third more primary issue for me is the cumulative impacts of the variety of systems that typically overburden and have undue stress on vulnerable communities throughout the city. So I look at the confluence of how all of these activities are impacting the communities as opposed to a singular standalone environmental impact. So the primary ones is, I'll concur with Genevieve's point of increased rain and increased heat. But the bigger one for me is the confluence of all of them, where they come together as cumulative stressors on those communities, and that could be chemical, non-chemical, and economic stressors as well. And I think part of what we look at in the environmental justice community is the confluence of events. Is rarely just a singular event. In my work at Overbrook, we talk about the confluence of events where community, environment, and health come together, because we look at the impacts on health as sort of the indicator as to what's actually happening to people. And I think that's where a great deal of the injustice takes place, because many of these health effects are things that take place over a course of time. So the actual actors or the policies of actors are not necessarily identified in real time. It's things that we see over the course of time. So therefore, we absolutely have to see and begin to measure and monitor how all of these acts of environmental occurrence are taking a serious effect on the health of people.
In your answer just now, you mentioned community, environment, and health, and I think that's a really good framework to have for environmental justice and thinking about the impacts. But it's I think it's not something that strikes me as something that we typically hear or traditionally hear has been talked about by environmental organizations. Do you think that a different approach or a different way of thinking is required to address these issues differently than the way traditional environmental groups have operated?
Yeah, I think one of the big issues is that we know historically people of color haven't been active in this work, and we know that people of color traditionally are those who are most affected by this work, by these conditions that we talk about throughout the work. And so one of the better practices that we know exists is the co-production of knowledge around environmental systems, equitable co-production of knowledge around environmental systems. And that means that we have to have broad engagement with the communities that are being impacted and have that voice of the affected communities in the decision-making around what best practices and remediation looks like. And so because it hasn't happened traditionally, I think there's a need for a variety of different types of groups that can begin to coalesce their experiences that in the past were siloed, but to begin to collaborate with other groups to begin to get to more authentic results. And let me give you an example. When we began our work about 22 years ago in the city, it was more about just looking particularly at the environmental effects. We were looking at stormwater and how stormwater was triggering combined sewer overflows and how that was, mitigating pollution in the communities. We were looking at domestic toxins as sort of a real burdensome condition that was an old infrastructure and it was impacting people's lives, and, issues like lead, et cetera. But until we started looking at the epidemiology of the communities, we really weren't quite getting to the essence of it. And so when we started looking at the epidemiology, we knew where elevated blood lead levels were, and it helped to target how we began to track and measure what are those conditions that are exposing young people in particular to lead. And so that became a really big deal when we started to combine our work with the health community, with the environmental community. It started to really just coalesce in such a way where it was very meaningful. And I think a great deal of that traditionally were that these organizations operated in silos. Mm-hmm. And so you would have your DEPs and environmental protection agencies talking about standards and regulations and policies. And we knew that it might have been impacting the health of people, but really weren't quite dealing with that as a primary responsibility. Then you have people at HHS is dealing with health, and science organizations dealing with health, but they weren't necessarily looking at what was causing those vectors that was affecting those people's health. And so now I think we have a different kind of leadership, particularly national leadership, that's sort of driving a responsibility of people to co-produce and to work one another to look at cause and effect, and to really even bring in community voices that help to bring a great deal more perspective to not only what's impacting people, but what's driving those impacts and who's being affected by it.
Thank you, Jerome. I'd like to pose a question to our next panel guest, Maurice. Now, Maurice, you've been with Clean Water Action for over 30 years. You've also been heavily involved with educating about lead exposure. So I'd like to get your reaction to the municipal water systems with lead contamination issues that have grabbed national attention in recent years. Certainly in Flint, Michigan, more recently in Jackson, Mississippi, we've seen the failure of public water systems and the impact that has on communities. So can you tell me what your reaction is to the failure of these water systems, and also what can be done in Philly to make sure that doesn't happen here?
Well, first of all, I should stop and say that there is really nothing new about the issues with these water systems. I mean, you can go back to when the Philadelphia water system was first created, and water was really not seen as a right, it was seen as a commodity. And the system was really built to cool the Europeans who weren't used to the hot temperatures here. And if you were a person of color, you had to go out and get it from a pump. So the idea that water is something that we all have a right to is not something that, we all assume it is. We turn on the faucet, it all comes out. We really don't appreciate how much of a real miracle that is. Most of the population of the world doesn't have access to water in just that way. but it's not different. It's not new. And, when we just look at where we are right now, just speaking to lead, of course, now lead gets in the water because it's in the pipes. It's in that pipe that comes from the street into the home. And they figure there are somewhere between 20 and 40,000 of these lead lines that are in Philly right now. And they tend to be in those areas where the infrastructure is, at its worst, which is, the underserved areas of the city. Although I will say this, the plumbing system we have was designed to last just over 100 years, and it's a lot older than that. So as we see these systems breaking down and water mains breaking everywhere, that's because the system is worn out. And even as we are now in the process of replacing that system, there's a lot of distrust about the water department and the work that it's doing. A mistrust that I will say is misplaced. In fact, I would say that in Philadelphia, we are very fortunate that we have our own water system, that we have our own scientists, that we are looking at what's going on here. In fact, we're better off in Philadelphia with our water than a lot of rural areas that maybe even have higher incomes, but are dealing with much smaller water systems that serve their water. I think that, when we look at Philly and where we are right now, I think the greatest danger, or the thing we need to be most concerned about, is maintaining the system that we have and maintaining and providing the opportunity for affordable water. I mean, if anybody listening to the news, we're talking about raising the price of water 20% over this next year. And we are in the poorest city in the country, so water is going to be expensive. Plus, the system has to be fixed and it has to be replaced. When a water main breaks, they're going to fix it because they have to. And we have to deal with both the systems that clean up our water coming in, and also treating the water that goes out. The whole stormwater system that we have in the city that's being built right now, all of those things are financed, through our water bills. And I think we are going to be running into this effort of saying, well, we shouldn't be paying so much for the water, and you have to pay what it costs to take care of the system. And that's going to be a challenge, as we move forward. But what's happened in Jackson, what happened in Flint, both situations are a crime. They were deliberate. They were deliberately done. They were done for political purposes. But step back, because the water systems in a lot of our cities are teetering on it. Had it not been for 9/11, we would have all found out that Washington, D.C. had issues that were not too far removed from Flint, but they got dealt with, and their system is in the point of being replaced. So I think that's pretty much the answer I can give to your question here. Water is essential, and we have to maintain those systems. And I think that we're blessed in Philadelphia to have the system that we have, and balancing out how we're going to pay for it, how we're going to maintain it, to make sure that everybody has access to clean drinking water is something that we are going to have to struggle with. And we have to find equity in this situation, so that it gets paid for, but that people aren't deprived of it as well.
Thanks, Maurice. I want to go to a question in the chat. Margaret mentioned that she attended a conference where the climate crisis was described as a threat multiplier, especially on social determinants of health, such as housing, health, et cetera, that have already been impacted by historic structural racism like redlining. What areas of Philly are most vulnerable to climate crisis as a threat multiplier? Great question. And any of you can answer.
Yeah, so she's absolutely right. Social determinants are multipliers. So we already know that our Black and Brown folks are always have historically been the most vulnerable in all pretty much all the major indicators, whether it's economic, whether it's through health, whether it's through environmental impacts. You know, so with the changing climate, uh, uh, there's an additional burden is placed on folks. And again, I always look at the health indicators. I mean, the you know, heat stress, strokes, hypertension. I mean, you can look at our heat maps, and those heat maps are lining up with our redlining maps, and the redlining maps line up with our poverty and underinvestments within communities and neighborhoods. And you see this very predictable tsunami of social disarray that's connected to the disinvestment of very predictable areas throughout our city. And so the challenge becomes, how do we prepare? How do we remediate? How do we empower?
Yeah.
Because the importance is to empower people and educate them on the ability to know how to recover and to have the dignity of being in a position to do that for themselves. And so it's going to matter how we place our investments and how we make those investments accessible to the citizens of the city.
We need to be talking about resilience and not just about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
It's here. It's really a question of how we are going to cope and how we're going to make sure that people have the resources to cope with what's going on. You know, I've always, I think that there is a higher level of sophistication among the people of color about climate change than perhaps is expected. I've been spending a lot of time working on projects around green stormwater infrastructure in these last several years. And the one statement that I know is very true is that people may be poor, but they are not unsophisticated in terms of understanding, you know, what is going on, and that these needs are critical. In many ways, I think what is being experienced in our underserved areas in this city is just a preview of what's in store for everyone. And dealing with what's going on there in a way that manages that is also the template for what is needed for everyone. I think it's very appropriate that there is so much energy now being focused on dealing with what's happening in those communities, dealing with it first. At least that's I'm going to say that's the language right now, is working to serve the underserved, because when you serve the least of us, you serve all of us. So it is a right place to put the energy and the right place to design what it is that we need to do to take the next steps. And we've got some very hard times coming, and they are not avoidable at this point. And I think we need to do our best to work to mitigate what's happening. But even more so, I think we need to work on looking at building resilience to address what is happening and what is only going to be coming in more say.
The only thing I'll add, so I think it's a good point to not think about just where, like which parts of Philadelphia may be at risk, but which Philadelphians may be at risk. And so we've talked about people of color, low-income residents. I think people with disabilities too, that community is often overlooked when we talk about environmental justice. And I think that's going to be really important, especially thinking about a hotter and wetter Philadelphia. And to the point about not looking at issues in isolation too and building resilience, what I've enjoyed seeing within the environmental movement is this broadening of, or environmental justice movement is this broadening of what we consider to be EJ issues. And so I think having programs like Built to Last in Philly are really important, where we're doing energy conservation work, but also like whole home repairs. And so we're going to need to see more resilient strategies like that are addressing multiple issues, so that we aren't going to have as much of this kind of this impact and this multiplier that you mentioned.
Thank you, and thanks for that question, Margaret. Another question that concerns going back to the issue of lead and water pipes. Do Philly residents have to apply to have their lead pipes removed, or does the water department contact you?
You own your water pipes. Water pipe that goes from your house to the street belongs to the house that is connected, that the responsibility for that belongs to you. Now, if the city is coming through and replacing your systems and replacing the water mains, you will get a call or a letter and an offer to replace that whole line from the middle of the street right into your house. If you don't, then what they do is they replace part of it. You know, only the part that goes to the cutoff switch. And that presents its own set of problems. I understand that there's a device that is used when you have a partially replaced line. It actually sets up a circumstance where it puts more lead into your water. I understand there's a device, I'm still trying to find the name of it, that they actually put in place that will mitigate that. But if you're on a block and you've gotten this request and you turned it down, and many people do, a lot of out of mistrust of the water department, you really need to be aware. And it costs it costs anywhere from $3,000 to $14,000, depending on how deep in the ground your line is to have it replaced. So this is a very big deal. It is another cost that needs to be dealt with in those homes around the city where they've got lead lines. And so it's not going to be the city that's going to be picking up the cost. And I will tell you the thing that bothers me, our circumstances that we own our lines when there is a huge commitment out of the president and the vice president to replace all the lines. But we don't have a mechanism necessarily to take advantage of that because it's not designed to go through a government system. It's one of the policy issues I think that we need to deal with. But there's a whole lot of money coming down right now. And I was at I was here in the city when I got to go to the presentation when the president and the vice president came and presented in the city. And they both made it very clear that they have a personal commitment to replace all the lead lines in the country. We've got to make sure we take advantage of this. That's a lot of money to spend for literally solving a problem. We got to get those 20 to 40,000 lead lines out of the city. We need to figure out how to do that while there's this infrastructure money available to us.
That were you gonna, sorry, I was gonna follow up with another question, but you look like you were gonna say something.
Yeah, I was gonna say something. Oh, yeah. Well, no, Maurice was right on target. In the $440 million that the president and vice president brought to the city was to replace the larger mains. It's still not addressing that issue in the homes. And that's part of what Maurice is talking about is there has to be a comprehensive effort and an outreach effort as well to get people to understand that the need, the responsibility, and the options. Really the cost risk analysis around not doing it. And I think we have to do a better job in letting people know that doing nothing sometimes is not a really good option.
It's not. We have 3,000 miles of streets in this city. They're going to replace about 19 miles of pipelines with the money they got. That just gives you a sense of how much work is involved. You know, on the one hand, we can look at it as maybe that's going to cost a fortune, but I'm going to tell you something. It's not, it's an investment. Because if that money is spent in the city, it's going to be spent and the people are going to have to work to make it happen. And that's opportunity for income. It's one of these investments that really makes sense to be made at a federal level. You know, to really put out the money to truly do the investment to replace all of this, because that's a whole lot of money that gets pumped into the economics of our city because the work is all going to be local.
One question that that this brings up for me is knowing that the part of your lead line that connects your house to the city line is owned by the homeowner, and that has to be replaced by the homeowner. What does that mean for the millions of renters in the city of Philadelphia? And how are there any protections for renters or ways that renters can find out about the status of the lead lines in the place that they're living?
Well, if you're living in a single family unit, and there's a water meter in your basement, you can determine if there is a lead line in your house just by knowing how to test to see what that pipe is made from. And I'll just make a reference to the water department that has a great piece of literature that will help you do that. All you need is a magnet and something to scratch it with, and it's about the color. So you can determine whether or not you have a lead line. If it's a lead line, it really is the owner's responsibility to replace that. So in that rented home, somebody owns it. They have a responsibility to replace that. Now, the lead and copper rule out of EPA is going to be requiring, as of next, I think a year from now, that a full inventory of where the lead lines are will have to be made available. And the city is now installing meters at all the homes, and they are slowly building that information of where the lead lines are and where they're not. It's really the first step. We got to know where they are exactly. I mean, between 20,000 and 40,000, a big number of difference. It's an estimate because that's the best that they can figure. I live on a street here in Mount Airy. All the houses were built at the same time. And I have noted that some of us have lead lines and some of us don't. So you can't make any assumptions about if there are lead lines there or not. Before there was always the knowledge that lead was a problem, but before it became something that was deemed illegal, plumbers and builders used whatever pipe was available that was least expensive. So you could have any mix of that when they put that system in, to put it down. So there is no assumption you can make. If your home was built before 1978, it could have anything in it, So, these are all things that are coming. The information is going to be available. And correct me if I'm wrong, Jerome, but I do believe if the owner is aware that they have a lead line there, they sort of have a responsibility to deal with that. Do I have that right?
Well, it depends on whether or not they have co-tenancy. Unfortunately, in many of these policies, you have the right to poison yourself, but you don't have the right to poison others.
But if you're renting a house and you discover it's got a lead pipeline in it, is there any obligation of the owner to handle that?
Oh, if the tenant complains, absolutely.
There you go.
But there are ways that again, you can make requests. There is requests that you can make with the Philadelphia Water Department to have an inspection of that line if you suspect that it's lead. There's ways to test. There are pamphlets that enable you to test to see whether you have lead service lines. So people are not in the position that they may have been 20 years ago where there weren't any options. I think we do have options, and we need to do a better job of outreach to let people know what those options are.
I'd like to pose a question to all the members of the panel, and I'll start with you, Genevieve. What does if we were to reach all of our goals with all of our environmental justice initiatives, and do well with getting the grant funding out to the organizations that will use it to improve our communities, what would that look like? What would that progress look like? In other words, what would you like to see for the future of Philadelphia as it relates to this issue?
So, I mean, it sounds like you're asking how will we know when we actually realize environmental justice? And so, I mean, to me, we identified populations that we know are at higher risk. So I'd say we'll know we're in an environmentally just city when race and socioeconomic status are no longer predictors of health outcomes. I think that covers a lot of what we've talked about today and the cumulative impacts as well.
Great, thank you. Maurice?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. What does progress look like in environmental justice in Philadelphia?
To me, it's knowing where the problems are so that we know when we fix them, they're resolved. You know, I went to school at Rutgers in 1972. I'll date myself. And I was an urban studies student, and I came across the river to see this great new program in the health department about lead paint and about dealing with lead paint. And it occurs to me that had they decided then that they were going to deal with 1/50th of all the lead paint problems in Philly every year, it wouldn't be there now. I suspect that most of it is still here, that we haven't decided to solve these problems yet. I have a theory that we should have a 50-year plan to get rid of everything, and then every year figure out how we can reduce that by 5 years. At least then we are focused on a mission to get rid of it all, but there isn't any. Right now, I had the, I'll call it a privilege to go through the 700-page 5-year strategic plan that released with the budget. And of course, I did that, you know, doing a word search so that I could look through it. At some point, it dawned on me to stop and just read a couple of them. There isn't a single agency in the city that's focused to solve a problem. Every agency is about managing the crisis, every single one. You know what happens when all you do is manage the crisis? It gets worse. So we don't yet have given sort of the political imperative to our elected officials that that's what we want. We are satisfied with making sure at least we stop pressing our political officials when everything feels okay for the moment. There are these problems happen. They didn't just happen. They happened over time. They happened due to neglect. And we need to start focusing on really identifying and saying, how do we solve this problem? I'm real big on waste and recycling. Anybody who knows me knows that. There is no reason whatsoever that we should have trash collection, dumping, or recycling as a problem. Not a single one. These are all systems that can be easily done and managed. And we keep on almost doing it and then not doing it because we seem to do just enough to satisfy everybody, and then we go back to zero again. But we have a responsibility as citizens and as voters to make sure our politicians know we want to solve the problem. What is the solution to the problem? And let's get started, however long it takes. Like I said, if they had set that goal 50 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about lead paint or lead as an issue. We'd be dealing with other things. And I'm convinced that we got plenty of work to do, that we aren't going to solve all of them, but we could certainly make this place one hell of a lot safer than it is right now.
Thank you, Maurice. Jerome?
What would progress look like? Well, progress would look like my zip code will not be an indicator of my mortality.
You're here.
And I think that I usually enjoy the phrase that Martin Luther King used, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I think when we talk about environmental justice, we're essentially talking about environmental injustice. And I think the key is that we've expanded what that injustice looks like because it's taking on different forms. You know, we talk about lead, but lead is a neurotoxin, and that neurotoxin influences behavior. So now we have to think about environment as it influences behavior, as another aspect of how we look at the injustice. When we see IQ of people being impacted by way of the toxins that they're experiencing, when they're unable to have consistent time in school because they're being aggravated by asthmatic conditions because there's so much poor air quality factors that they have to contend with on a daily basis. So we have to look at injustice as an entire vesture of measuring what these effects are on people's lives and how we need to look at its potential harm. And I think if you don't see it as a holistic experience, then you don't really understand the problem. And so the solution for me is that we start seeing healthier rates in communities that traditionally aren't recognized for being healthy. And we start seeing vibrant activities in communities in places where we traditionally don't expect there to be vibrant activity in those communities, where people feel safe to go outside and to be able to exercise and to be able to hang out with their family. Those are the kinds of indicators that should, the livability of our communities is an indication of the progress. I think that people want to be able to have dignified quality lives, and it doesn't matter whether you do that on a small budget or a large budget. You know, I grew up in a period in Philadelphia where I saw people, I have experiences with people who had beautiful lives and didn't have a lot of money. I know times when blocks were getting together and doing things collectively and working on keeping the environment safe. You know, in the 70s where folks were, you know, where we had to deal with lead in paint in cars, not just lead in paint, but lead in cars. I mean, the film of lead was all, the car fumes were all over the steps and houses, and people would go out and clean those steps collectively. So it wasn't so much about just the economics alone, but all of the other factors that allow people to have the dignity to enable them to live a healthy quality of life in the city. So progress to me is that all these injustices, all these systematic injustices are mitigated so that people can have access to their human dignity. That's what progress looks like to me.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge there is another question in the chat that we can address regarding air quality. Our town has a big problem with smoke in the air from fire pits and grills that are allowed to smoke in the summer, from fire pits in spring and fall, especially in the poor neighborhoods where houses are much closer together and where many residents and their children have health concerns like asthma and other lung ailments. We have laws against burning leaves in the fall. None of the laws concerning how far away from buildings fire sources should be are being enforced. Does Philadelphia do anything to regulate smoke from these sources to improve air quality? So regarding air quality, asking about the city's enforcement of smoke from burn pits and or from fire pits and grills.
I can have two responses to that. One, in Pennsylvania, there aren't laws that prohibit the burning of leaves. So let me just make that clear. Two, there are rules. I actually had this happen on my block. I had a neighbor with a fire pit with a next door neighbor to him with asthma. And it turned out to be a community issue I had to get involved in because it caused some issues. But the city did come in our case, they did come in and they did cite the neighbor who was burning, and it was stopped. Now, I live in Mount Airy, so having the rules enforced is something that happens here, and that's not true everywhere in the city. But I do know that the rules do exist. I'm curious if the person who put in the question is from Philadelphia. They commented our town, so I know your crowd is much bigger than that. But at least I know in Philadelphia there are rules. I only know that because of the social issue I had to resolve between two neighbors. Norristown. Okay. You have to check your regs in Norristown to see if they have any rules about that. They do in Philadelphia.
Well, I'd like to thank our guest speakers, our guest panelists for joining us for tonight's discussion. I think we had it was a really informative discussion. Really glad that we could talk about this issue here on Thursday Night Live. Thank you so much to Genevieve, LaMarr, LeMee, for joining us from the city's Office of Sustainability.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Jerome for joining us. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
And thank you also to Maurice for joining us tonight. Great discussion, lots of great information.
Thank you for having me here. I always like to speak with Jerome because I always learn something new. Thanks, Jerome.
Thank you, Maurice.
And thank you all for joining us for this evening's final Thursday Night Live of the season. If you would please unmute and thank our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was wonderful.
Thank
Learned a
you.
lot.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you. Have a good
A lot
night.
of work to be done.
Thank
you.
you.
That was great.
Thank you all. Take care.
Learned a lot.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good luck to you.
All right.
All right, everyone, have a great evening. Thanks again for joining us. Good night.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.
Thanks, Aaliyah.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaliyah. That was wonderful.